What is going on, everyone? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the season premiere of Watchmen on HBO. I don't want to bury my immediate feelings deep in the review, so for now I'll say I'm cautiously optimistic. While I was holding my breath initially, gradually I found myself relaxing, getting into it, and I'll definitely be returning for more in the weeks to come. But because this show is inspired by a beloved comic and explores political themes, naturally, a lot of people are going to have a lot of extreme reactions, but I can't worry about that. I can only speak to my own reaction, and I was relieved to see that there's a little bit of nuance and some shades of gray at play in the story, something that is very rare in these politically polarized times. Created by writer Damon Lindelof, Watchmen takes place in 2019, with the events of Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' legendary comic serving as the backdrop, meaning that the present-day world of 2019 in this show is quite different from our own. Damon Lindelof wrote the show in a way where knowledge of the comic is not required to enjoy the show, but my attitude is always to encourage people to read that remarkable story, whether they plan on watching the show or not. I was 10 when the comic debuted, and while I was a comic book reading fanatic at the time, I totally missed it until years later, where I read this trade paperback many times over, so much so that the pages now are turning a little bit brown. If you're a fan of Alan Moore's work, at the end of this video, I'll make some additional Alan Moore reading recommendations, but my point is that I have a lot of love and a lot of affection for this world, and anytime someone other than Alan Moore explores this world, I get a little anxious. In any event, what's interesting about the status quo of this show is how it's set in a world that's already grappled with the legal and ethical gray areas of vigilantes and masks in the past many times over, going all the way back to the days of the first appearance of Hooded Justice in 1938 and then the formation of the Minutemen in 1939. As you've seen in the trailer, this is a world where people have a variety of points of view on people who wear masks. Do they save lives? Are they cruel? Is there any real difference between people who wear masks, irrespective of their motives or what side of the law they might be on? But in addition to superheroes, this setting differs from ours in a lot of key ways. The tech is totally different. Robert Redford's been president for decades, and Ozymandias' master plan to bluff the world into world peace by staging an alien invasion largely worked, apart from a few conspiracy theorists out there who don't believe in it because, as every Watchmen fan knows, Rorschach's journal with the truth about what Ozymandias really did is still out there. So before I go into details about this episode, we should talk a bit about Damon Lindelof, who's one of the few screenwriters out there with brand name recognition. A lot of people out there intensely dislike his work and blame him for a lot of the shortcomings on shows like Lost or movies like Prometheus. I share some of these frustrations. However, his work on the show The Leftovers won me back over in a big way. I think The Leftovers is one of the best shows of the last decade, which gave me hope that he'd find a way to repeat that success with Watchmen. Now, part of the success of Alan Moore's comic was his ability to write incredibly dynamic superhero characters with distinctly different worldviews, making it all the more exciting when they encountered one another. The comedian Rorschach and Ozymandias could not be more different morally or politically, but Alan Moore managed to make them all equally fascinating in their own right. My biggest question going into this show was whether or not Damon Lindelof would be able to pull off the same trick. We live in comically polarized times where people will use every trivial excuse to indulge in tribal warfare, and admittedly, some audience members out there prefer their content to fall neatly into clearly defined partisan camps. But in my opinion, if you want to construct a story with the staying power of a masterpiece like Alan Moore's source material, you have to rise above all that crap. I'm all for storytellers exploring whichever provocative political themes they wish to, but exploration is entirely different from a preachy lecture, meaning that Damon Lindelof's show will have to function dramatically as something more than just thinly veiled propaganda. And from what I saw in this first episode, I think he's succeeding. Who knows, there might be other writers on the staff with more of an agenda that they wish to push, but from what I've seen so far, the conflict on the show is refreshingly complex. Anytime a writer wants to build or flesh out a fictional setting, giving the audience the information they need can be a really tricky thing. What I liked is how this episode didn't give us a giant information dump, but chose instead to tease out the details organically, one drop at a time, always leaving me interested in hearing more. The first episode is concerned primarily with a conflict brewing in Tulsa, Oklahoma between the police force and a terrorist group known as the 7th Cavalry. Tulsa has a history of racial strife involving people in masks going all the way back to a massacre of a black community in 1921, but the 7th Cavalry, they take their inspiration from the look as well as the journal of Rorschach, even quoting one of his most famous passages in one of their videos. But from what I've seen so far, something tells me that if Rorschach were still around, he might be the first to give him a proper ass kicking. In opposition to them, we have a police force that goes masked at all times, ever since the White Night years ago when several police officers were targeted in assassination attempts. But not only are the cops masked, they have active vigilantes working for them like the Red Scare, Panda, Looking Glass played by Tim Blake Nelson, and Sister Night played by Regina King. Nelson and King also look particularly cool in their costumes, I should add. But the rules of engagement are quite different for these cops who can't even use lethal force unless Panda gives their guns a buzz. That said, Chief Judd Crawford, played brilliantly by Don Johnson, is more than happy to let his masked vigilantes indulge in enhanced interrogation techniques, leading to this epic showdown on a ranch where they whip out their big gun, a ship that is either Night Owl's owlship, Archie, or a very loving copy. As a result of this battle, Chief Crawford gets lynched, but it remains to be seen whether or not the 7th Cavalry was responsible. In the teaser for the upcoming episodes, we see a government agent saying otherwise. Plus, there's a mysterious note that Lou Gossett Jr.'s character, Will Reeves, found on his body. The note simply says, "Watch over this," precisely the same words a young boy encountered back in 1921 after witnessing the slaughter of his friends and family. Something tells me there's a criminal conspiracy at play that is very old and runs very deep. Also, there's a beautiful little nod to the source material when we see a drop of blood drop from Judd down to his badge, an obvious nod to the comedian's badge in the first issue of the comic. For Watchmen fans, there are all kinds of fun little Easter eggs, like a poster dedicated to the character Dollar Bill, who was shot back in 1947 when his cape got stuck in a revolving door, or the book Under the Hood by Hollis Mason on Chief Crawford's desk. Apparently, Vietnam is now a state after Dr. Manhattan's role in the Vietnam War. We also see ads for a popular show called American Hero Story, which is based on the exploits of all the classic members of the Minutemen back in the 1940s. So far, we've seen very little of Dr. Manhattan, apart from some very brief footage of him tearing down some construction that he built on Mars, but if you blink, you'll miss it. Sadly, we didn't get any scenes with Laurie Blake, formerly known as Laurie Jupiter, aka the Second Silk Spectre, but it appears as if she's going to enter the story to investigate the killing of Judd. We get a few quick scenes with Jeremy Irons, who is perfectly cast as Ozymandias. While all the papers say he's dead, we see that he's alive and well and celebrating the anniversary of his staged alien attack with a cake in the shape of that giant monster. And speaking of which, the weirdest thing all episode is when we see the sky open up and just starts raining little baby squids all over the place. And my question is this connected to what Ozymandias did, or is it part of a sustained effort to maintain the illusion of ongoing interdimensional attacks? I'm dying to learn more on that front. But Adrian Veidt, he seems to interact with only a handful of servants who I suspect are not even human. His butler at one point suggests cutting the cake with a horseshoe, which to me suggests that Ozymandias might have built them, or maybe they're connected to the life forms that Dr. Manhattan was talking about wanting to create on Mars. The servant gives Ozymandias a watch, and I may be mistaken on this, but is that the watch Dr. Manhattan was retrieving right before the accident that changed him in the first place? As is always the case with Watchmen, clocks, watches, and their sounds are a recurring motif. Another recurring idea is this idea that nothing ever ends, a quote from Dr. Manhattan at the end of the original series, which was used in all the posters for the show. To what degree we'll see connections between what has come before and what new story Lindelof is crafting remains to be seen. Also, I need to give one final shout out to the music, which was composed by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. Anytime Trent Reznor creates a score to anything, I sit up and pay attention. But what I liked is how there are a few scenes where the music almost reminded me of old school John Carpenter movies. In any case, I'm definitely on the hook with this show for now. It's going to run for a total of 9 episodes, drawing to a close on December 15th. But between Joker and now Watchmen, this fall's been great for fans of superhero shows and movies who are tired of the timidity and caution of so many PG-13 concepts. But as we wait for the next episode, if you're itching for something to do, I'd suggest you hunt down and enjoy some of Alan Moore's comics. This show would not exist without him, but his career's given us so much more than just Watchmen. The very first Alan Moore comic I ever read, Superman Annual 11 from 1985, remains one of my all-time favorites. His entire run on Swamp Thing is one of the best supernatural horror tales I've ever read. Batman the Killing Joke is the gold standard for Batman stories. But you also have his America's Best Comics era, which gave us Tom Strong and Promethea, Top 10, which is screaming to be a show, and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Ignore the atrocious movie, which was an abomination, and just read this comic instead. But I'm barely scratching the surface on his total output. He's an incredibly prolific writer, but if you're looking for something terrifying to read for Halloween, check out his 2010 comic Neonomicon, which is my favorite Lovecraftian story I've ever read that was not actually written by Lovecraft himself. But I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap this sucker up. It appears as if, at least for now, HBO's got another winner on their hands, and we also have His Dark Materials coming at us in either like a week or a week and a half. I'm looking forward to following both of these shows, and if you want to talk more about Watchmen or His Dark Materials or HBO or whatever, best place to reach me is always on Twitter at Colbrax, or leave me a comment in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, like the video, subscribe to the channel. That's very helpful to me. But thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.